Welcome to the Norma Lytton Program for Museum Education at the Yale Center for British Art. I'm Linda Friedlander, Head of Education. Generous support for this program has been established in the memory of Norma Lytton by her family. Norma was an active docent for over 20 years and subsequently spent a decade engaged in research for the Center's Department of Painting and Sculpture. For those who may be unaware, Bernie Lytton passed away this past spring. He was out of the country when it happened, so perhaps some of you might not have known. The Lyttons were very special friends of mine and also the Center's. Today's program will be a conversation about Why the Museum Matters, a recently published book by Daniel Weiss with 3 members of the Center's Student Guide program.
Thanks everyone for being here. I'm here to introduce our guest of honor today. So Daniel H. Weiss is the former president and CEO of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and is the author of Why the Museum Matters, the book which we'll be discussing today. In the book, Weiss outlines the history of museums, tracing their evolution since classical times, and goes on to discuss the important role of these cultural institutions in the present, drawing upon his experience leading the Met. Weiss earned a PhD from Johns Hopkins University in medieval and Byzantine art with a minor in classical Greek art and architecture and an MBA from the Yale School of Management. He served as president of Haverford College and Lafayette College and as dean of the Johns Hopkins Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. He is currently Homewood Professor of the Humanities at Johns Hopkins and serves on the board of the Yale University Art Gallery. And now our panelists will begin to introduce ourselves. I'm Isaidy Medina. I'm a junior at Silliman College. I'm majoring in history with a certificate in medieval studies.
Hello everyone, my name is Ana Rodrigues. I'm a junior in Brantford College and I'm majoring in urban studies and art history.
Hi, my name is Tommy. I'm a senior in styles and I'm majoring in history. And since I'm a senior, I was just about to start college when you started writing this book. You mention in Why the Museum Matters that you started writing just before kind of COVID-19 started spreading around the world. And the book talks a lot about the past and the future of museums, but it's also clearly written at this time of uncertainty and closure and upheaval. Now we're over 3 years removed from that spring, and I'm kind of curious to just start by hearing where your head is at now. So, kind of watching the Met and helping guide the Met out of the worst times of the pandemic. Are there ideas in the book that have been reinforced by that? Are there ideas that have been challenged, beliefs you've had that have been challenged? Yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me, and it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk about this work with the 3 of you. So I wrote the book in the first instance because it was increasingly clear to me, as it is to many people who work in museums, that our profession on the one hand was thriving and on the other hand was undergoing a state of dramatic change. Enormous pressure from all kinds of directions for the museum to be a little bit different or a lot different than what it had been historically. And as I was thinking about those issues, I have always used writing as a way primarily for advancing my own learning. The best reason to write a book is to learn something and then communicate that in the best way you can. So I began thinking about that prior to COVID, and then when COVID came, it provided both the circumstance for more dramatic change and the context for writing, since my social life had been diminished a lot, and I was able, therefore, to focus on writing. The arguments that I make in the book, I think, have held up very well over the last several years, though I would say there is, in any book project, once you finish the book, 5 minutes after the book is published, it's already changing in the world. That's what happens. And what I would say has been 2 things I would observe. One was, at the time I was writing the book, the issues around social justice and dramatic change and the ways in which museums can and should be responsive to the environments around them was alive in the air all the time. But I sensed that, like everything else in our society, those issues would become polarizing because of the ways in which we, as a society, think about discussion and dialogue, and that has absolutely happened, not only in museums, but everywhere. And that is a source of great disappointment to me, that we can't have more thoughtful conversations about issues of concern to all of us without having to navigate this territory. That's one. The other is, I think that museums began, before the COVID moment and before I began this book, to think much more self-consciously around issues of ethics as being at the center of what it means to be a civic institution. Not just that we have to behave ethically and we don't want to get in trouble, and if we're going to acquire works of art, we better hope that we can hang on to them and they can withstand scrutiny. that had been the point of view for more centuries, that's how they operate. Something has shifted, and that is that we are increasingly self-aware that institutions, cultural institutions, civic institutions, have an obligation to behave in a certain way in our society, to model a certain kind of discourse and engagement that is actually central to what it means to live in a free society. So I would say I'm preparing the next generation of this work for a series of lectures I'm giving later this year, and I'm entitling them the Ethical Museum. And the idea is all of these themes that are so important to us that are live now, they have an ethical component that is more significant than it was 5 years ago, 3 years ago, and I think it's going to be an enduring part of what we expect of museums, and that is entirely a good thing.
Yeah, and on that topic of polarization and ethics and sort of rethinking the way that the museum is meant to handle those things, sort of as we were reading and as we were discussing this book, we noticed that Why the Museum Matters has really, at times, a focus on the difficulties of navigating controversy in an institution like the Met. And when I was reading those passages in particular, I couldn't help but think about some readings that I've read for my own classes, specifically about historically significant examples of what we would call museum controversy. So what comes to mind is Harlem on my mind, of course, in like 1969, when the Met, an institution I'm sure you're familiar with, in aiming to celebrate the history of the Harlem neighborhood, was met with a really enormous amount of backlash and protests upon opening because of its failure to include Black artists and input from Harlem community members. So obviously none of us were around when that happened. Tommy, Isaidy, and I were not alive when that happened. But that historical moment is a really poignant example of the fallout and community distrust, especially that can arise from those such events. So that explanation, sort of background, leads me to the central question of how do you think museums and similar institutions should deal with their mistakes or perceived mistakes about these types of situations? And what has the Met learned from its past faults when dealing specifically with marginalized communities in similar situations?
Sure. Several questions there. So first of all, I would say that there's a leadership question embedded there and how one deals with mistakes. And we'll start with that, and then I can talk a little bit about the Met as an institution with a legacy. There are two kinds of mistakes that we face as museum leaders. One of them are mistakes we make, and that's different than historical mistakes that Tom Hoving made or Jane Norma made or someone else made a long, long time ago. And I think the approach to addressing those is different. But when I was first beginning my career in administrative work as a leader, the best advice I got from anyone who was a dear friend and a mentor was do not spend your time worrying about making mistakes. You will make them. Do make the best decisions you can, get the counsel that you can get, but when you make a mistake, the best thing and most important thing to do is own it and fix it. And I've always done that in my career. So we have made mistakes in my time at the Met and at Haverford and everywhere else I've been. But I have always found that people are very generous and forthcoming in supporting you if you own your mistake and explain why you made that mistake and what it is that you're going to try to do to fix that. People are perfectly well there. That's not as interesting a question, I think, as the legacy issue here. How do institutions that have a whole history of making decisions and collecting objects and behaving in certain ways hold themselves accountable as the environment changes? This is an issue for Yale. This is an issue, and Yale's older than the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There's a long list of things this institution has done that Peter Salovey has to say he's sorry for, that he wasn't even born yet. So I think the issue there is, I'll come back to this concept of what it means to be an ethical institution. And to back up from there a little bit further. Institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art or Yale University are ultimately enterprises that are founded by, sustained by, led by the communities that created them. They are not government-owned, they are not agencies of some larger enterprise. And as a result, there's a dynamic there around the concept of shared governance, which operates at any number of levels. At Yale, it does within the Yale University Art Gallery, as it does within the university. And in that context, decisions have to be made collectively, and that in fact, the amount of authority I had as CEO of the Metropolitan wasn't all that vast. If I could not bring the curators with me, or the staff, or the mayor, or the donors, I was done. In the same way as a college president, it isn't really ultimately executive authority that Peter Salovey has any more than I had. It's the capacity to engage a community around shared purpose. So how does a community then address the issue of decisions that were made in a different time, in a different moment, with different expectations? And I think for them to be, for accountability to be authentic, it has to be based on a real interrogation of the issue. Why was that decision made 80 years ago? Whether it was ethical or not ethical at the time. Presumably it was made in a different set of expectations. And what can we authentically do in the institution today to try to do right by that history and correct that? And that varies from circumstance to circumstance. In my experience, and when I was at the Met, we were certainly dealing with issues around collection practices and other factors that, again, when you live in the world over time can change. I would convene discussions and ways of engaging those issues to try to come up with an approach that recognizes two things. One, change is needed, acknowledgement that these decisions would no longer withstand scrutiny and would not be right in the light of the world today. But on the other hand, we are an institution that exists in the world that does powerful good. And dismantling the whole institution because of decisions that were made in the past is not what my job is. I wasn't at the Met to do that. So it's finding that balance between living in the present, acknowledging the past, and recognizing that places like Yale or the Metropolitan are perpetual institutions, which means our job is not to solve every problem today, but to make the institution better incrementally. And if we're on a journey of improvement, then we're always going to be a better version of ourselves over the course of generations. And that's really the direction we should be going.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for that answer. I think that as we were reading, we were also interested in the leadership question and what can leaders of museums do. And in Why the Museum Matters, you stress that museum leaders should work and plan in accordance with their mission statements. And on a more granular level, how did the Met's mission statement influence your decision-making process during your time as president?
Thank you for that question. This may sound like, to begin anyway, with an obvious point, but I actually think that one of the most important things that a leader can do is figure out actually what the mission statement means and how that mission statement can be inflected from one moment to the next. And to be CEO of the Met during the years of COVID was a completely different job than it was to be CEO of the Met 40 years ago or 30 years ago, even if actually the mission statement wasn't all that different. The mission statement at the Met, which I cannot remember exactly, it's probably in the book.
You know the highlights.
I know the highlights. It's to collect, conserve, study, and present the art of the world in ways that recognizes its important contributions to civilization and understanding of history. That's the gist of it. That's an enormously wide platform around which to do things. So it is, I think, what I have always done in these jobs is I try to figure out exactly how does that mission statement reflect the circumstances we're in today? What are the particular challenges and opportunities that we face? And for an institution, well, for the Met, not an institution like the Met, but for the Met, they had already embarked on a journey of being an institution that was a closer approximation of its ideal self as a place in service to the world. I remember as a child going to visit the Met, which had the same mission, but there were all kinds of things that were very obvious to me that I wasn't really welcome there. That you don't really know a lot about art. We don't have any signage up because there wasn't even a sign outside the building telling you what it was. And there was this almost this presumption that if you don't really know, maybe this isn't where you should be. So how can we be more self-conscious about recognizing the purpose of a museum like the Met, given its collections, its resources, its ambition, should serve everyone who has an interest in this institution, whether it's a preschooler or an advanced scholar in the history of art, and everyone in between. And that means developing constellations of programs that serve those different needs, building collections that reflect that larger mission, and having just the environment set up in a way that makes clear to people that they're welcome. Really hard to do. If you're a school child in Staten Island and you've been to Manhattan twice in your life, and you've never been to a museum like that, it's actually terribly intimidating to come into that place. And then once you come in, what do? So we put in place, realizing our mission, very significant resources to make sure that what we learned is if we can get people in the museum once or twice and give them a good experience, and they know how to come in and where to hang up their coat and how to get a ticket, where the bathrooms are, they're going to come back. And in fact, we did this with school children, young school children, knowing that if they had that experience, they will bring their parents back. And that's what happens. They have this experience and then they can come and share this. So enacting the mission in the moment requires, on the one hand, a deep respect for what the core identity of the institution is, and recognizing what are the opportunities we have at this moment to do better. One more thing to say about the Met, since you asked.
Well, that's why we're here.
Yes, right. Not so explicit in the mission statement at the Met, but absolutely central to its purpose and what defines everything it does is a commitment to scholarship and the advancement of knowledge. Every exhibition, every program, every conference, every initiative has to have around it the idea that it's going to shed new light on something. Because in the absence of that, we become a little bit closer to something like an entertainment. And that isn't what, and I'm not trying to sound snobbish or that entertainment is bad, it's a different thing. The Met is an educational institution. It seeks to inspire people so that at the center of everything that they do is the idea, there's a new idea here, there's something here we can learn differently, there's some assumption we can challenge. And that animates everything. And if you forget that, and if that becomes less important, we all know that scholarship is expensive, sometimes it's wasteful, how long do you have to pay that scholar to write a book, and who's going to read it anyway? All of that, if you go down that path and begin to dismantle the core of what makes these institutions so distinguished. So I held on to the idea that scholarship should be in everything, and accessibility and programmatic engagement with the community, broadly writ, is fundamental to our ability to realize our mission at this moment.
Yeah, I certainly know, for me, just the job I was working last summer, the Met Scholarship was really helpful. The timeline of art history, the collection of essays online, that was just an enormous help to me. And something that we were wondering is, you mentioned scholarship is expensive, right? And even an organization like the Met, there's finite resources. So I'm interested on maybe a little bit more of a granular level. How do you balance this obvious importance of scholarship with also trying to meet the needs of the community, and like you're saying, getting people to come back, getting kids to bring their families, and what role scholarship can play in getting that to happen?
Right. Well, one way to think about the issue of scholarship is to think about it in terms of fundamentally what scholarship is about is creating new insight and new knowledge and advancing a question in some direction. So when I say that scholarship informs everything the Met does, I don't only mean that if we're going to do a show on Manet, everybody knows about Manet, we've got to say something different. I'm not just saying that. It's also, how do we conduct tours? What are the most advanced ways of engaging pedagogically with people? What are the right ways to take people through a museum? What is the best museological approach to exhibition and spatial design and lighting? Every part of that experience, because the Met has the resources to do that, it can invest in excellence in all of those things and recognizing there's new learning and new ideas in every profession in the institution. The great trade-off, of course, is every institution, regardless of how well resourced it is, at some moment confronts limitations in resources. And that's not a bad thing either, because in my career, I have learned that constraints around resources simply make you be better, more thoughtful, more accountable than just throw money at something. And as a result, I tried to instill that discipline at the Met. We built a budget system that we hadn't had before that was both in the moment, we had some financial challenges in my years there, but also extending out into the future so that we knew that decisions we're making today, we're actually going to be able to pay for them in 10 years too. And we're not burdening our successors with obligations that they didn't choose to have. Within that discipline, there's always the question, why are we going to fund your idea? Explain how that's going to come to life, and how are you addressing these challenges? And I think living in an environment of those kinds of resource constraints, in a healthy environment where merit and fairness are obviously what gets rewarded, then the institution raises itself and it balances its budgets. And that's what we tried to do. You can't, in the end, do everything. And one other part of your question is about accessibility. We don't have to have this conversation this afternoon because it actually gets us into the land of boring. But one of the things I faced was, how did we fund the Metropolitan when our admissions policy of pay as you wish was failing? People weren't paying as they wished, and the museum was showing very significant deficits. So how do you hold in balance, on the one hand, the desire to be a completely accessible institution, and on the other, fund it, invest in scholarship, be excellent, be sustainable in an institution that is not funded by the government? Who pays? That's something I dwell on in the book because I think it's a fundamental question for any community enterprise, including the Met. And what we had to come up with as a solution wasn't ideal, but it was based on those principles. You see, you asked a short question.
Now, we're talking about physically bringing people into museums and sort of how that has changed over the past couple of years at the Met. But we're sort of living in an age now where to visit a museum, you don't have to physically be there because of the production of so many online resources. We're just curious, especially for us, because of the time when we were entering college, so many museums were really, really enhancing the level of effort they were putting in and resources they were putting in to their online resources to get people in the doors. We're interested in hearing your perspective about how museums have adapted to incorporate more of that virtual content, especially in response to the pandemic, but maybe just in general. Do you feel like there are any advantages to this shift or disadvantages to this shift? And is this something that you think should continue in a post-pandemic world where now, the Met is open to the public again?
Yes, I think it is entirely a good thing. These advances in technology for museums has been entirely positive in two ways. One is that technology also allows people who are in the museum to have better experiences. There are all kinds of ways that we can use technology to enliven and enrich a learning experience. It doesn't substitute for or replace the real thing, the object they're there to see. But as we all know, you go into a museum and you can see all kinds of remarkable things that technology can do. The greater concern was, in the advent of great digital capabilities, that if digital images are as good as the real thing, why are people going to bother coming all the way to New Haven to come to the British Art Center when they can actually see it online? And what we have learned, not just at the Met, but everywhere, is that's exactly the opposite of what happens. That as people explore and learn from their own technology, and we saw this at COVID, it heightens their curiosity and their desire to learn more. Not every single person, but it makes actually the interest in learning about the object itself greater and more intense than dissipating that interest and they move on to the next thing. That does happen, and that's not a terrible thing. Moreover, for institutions, again, like the Met and Yale, many, many people who visit our websites will never come to New Haven or to New York. It's a huge resource for them. For school children all over the world who don't get to travel to museums, they can come onto the Met's website, as you were describing, Tommy, and seeing the timeline of art history and 450,000 works of art that are reproduced in very high quality resolution online. And all of the other content, video material, and all of this stuff that allows them to learn that in the absence of that, they would have a dusty old book that's out of date, and that's it. So I think all of those technologies lift us and make us better. The challenge is just figuring out, not just in the museum world, but in the world all around us, how do we harness these technologies in useful ways? What do we do with AI? How does that work in our society? What does that mean to the act of writing? And all kinds of things that we're struggling with everywhere. Museums are in the same setting, but I think it has only helped us realize our mission in a distinctive way, but a better way.
Thank you. I think that in talking about bringing people to the Met and the public of the museum, we were interested in while reading. We obviously know that the Met is a very large museum and well-known, and it's a very expansive collection that can be accessed by people all over, but we were sort of wondering who the public of the Met is and who comes to the Met, and whether there's a hierarchical prioritization of these publics, and do some publics matter more than others at the Met?
Great question. With regard to the size of the Met, and that'll answer your question. When I first got to the Met, and if you're wondering if these institutions are competitive, the head of buildings and construction was explaining the building to me, and we have 2.4 million square feet, which makes the Met this bigger than the Louvre. Okay, that's good to know. I appreciate that. The audiences of most comprehensive museums, most museums that seek to be encyclopedic or universal, there's a difference in those terms, but the idea to be expansive in what it collects, the audiences are really almost infinite. That at the Met, as I mentioned earlier, we seek to attract and engage anyone who has a passing interest in the museum. And there are all kinds of reasons people are drawn to museums. They might just be curious about the work of architecture they walk past on Fifth Avenue. Or they might have come all the way around the world in order to see a single work of art. There are lots of reasons people come. So the challenge and the art of getting it right is figuring out ways to do that that is respectful of all the different expertise levels and interest levels. There is no most important audience for any museum, certainly not at the Met. In my years there, we never had conversations that dwelled on making sure that scholars are particularly well served or donors are particularly well served. You want to pay attention to all of them. In some ways, the most challenging audiences are those that have very little experience with art, because you don't always know what's in their head or what's keeping them from coming. And art history, like some other rarefied disciplines, can lend itself or can lean in the direction of being pedantic and a little bit elitist. And it makes it a little bit, if you don't use the right language and you're presenting works of art in ways that presume knowledge they don't have, then very quickly people get turned off. On the other hand, pandering to the audience is always a bad idea, always a bad idea. One never wants to treat anyone as though they aren't worthy of being treated with respect. So finding the right language, finding the right kind of discourse to connect people, and in an exhibition of scale where maybe 500,000 or 1 million people will come to see an exhibition, it consists of all of those people. So what do you put on the labels? How do you arrange the objects? How much knowledge do we expect them to have? When we juxtapose works of art for an art historical argument, how much do we need to call that out? And there are, of course, the curators who conceive the exhibition are at the center of that, but there are exhibition designers, there are conservators, there are a whole host of their educators who come into that discussion to talk about how that should work so that that experience works as well as it can. That said, finally, most exhibitions do have a target audience in mind. There is an idea that is at work that might move up or down on a continuum of level of expertise and so forth. So putting all those things together is challenging, but all audiences, anyone who's interested in coming should be welcomed as though they're the most important visitor that day. And I will say, finally, the Met had, prior to COVID, over 7 million visitors a year. And I'm not the only one. Anytime we would receive letters or expressions of concern about bad treatment or someone treating them in a way that was alienating, it was deeply troubling because we knew, especially for people who haven't been there often, one bad early experience and they're out of the museum business for the rest of their lives. They just thought, I'm not going to go to those places. They treated me badly, they treated me with disrespect, and you want to avoid that.
Yeah, I think your response there touched on the balance between you want people to have a good experience and you want to make them feel comfortable, but you also don't want to be talking down to them or in some way kind of telling them how the museum is going to work for them.
Right.
And it kind of reminded me of a passage from the book where, just briefly to explain, you talk about people being upset. There was a Baltus on display, and people felt like kind of the imagery deserved like a content warning for visitors before they saw the work, just warning them that this is sexually explicit content of a young woman. And the Met said, no, we're not going to do that. What you did do is you kind of changed the label, you added greater explanation of the work's importance. And I guess kind of drawing from that example, I'm curious, we found a lot of times with these content warning controversies, which the Met is far from the only institution that's had to deal with this, a lot of times it comes from people being concerned about recent political events, recent kind of developments in the world. Do you feel like, in this case, obviously, the developments kind of came to you in the form of a petition to the museum, but do you feel like a museum like the Met has the responsibility to kind of almost preemptively address these world events? And if you're not going to do that with like a content label, what are kind of some strategies to do that in a way that works for all the visitors and works for the museum's mission too?
Well, that's a very, very difficult issue to navigate because the world is changing very quickly, and as you say, situation on the ground can change rapidly. I think it's important for institutions like the Met not to be seen as partisan political organizations. That's not what they are. We're here for everyone. That means at some level we have to allow different voices. At every level we have to allow different voices to be heard. We should respect expertise always, I think it's really important that the voice of people who are trained and expert in an area should be given the opportunity. Not every voice is equally valid around every subject. Most people, an art historian may have a particular view about a work of art that is based on 25 years of study, that is informed in different ways than someone who saw that work of art for 30 seconds and has an opinion. They're entitled to their opinion, but there's a difference in, so one wants to respect expertise. One wants not to be engaged in partisan politics, but there are certainly human rights issues. There are issues around being engaged in the world in an empathetic way. I'll give you one small example. There was a painting on the walls of the Met for a long time that was, I don't remember the artist's name, but he was identified as Russian at a time when no one was really paying that much attention to it. But he was actually Ukrainian. And we were approached by people who were representative of Ukraine and said, it isn't right that this label would actually not acknowledge this person was born and raised in Ukraine and is Ukrainian. The person was already dead. And we acknowledge that. So that's just truth in labeling. That mattered to get it right. That this cultural object came from that place at that time. So there are things like that that we do. I am not concerned, and I don't think we should be concerned, about just generally not offending or irritating people. You're going to do that. Not deliberately. I don't think being provocative just for the sake of being provocative is a good idea. In the case of the Baltus painting, it is for many people an offensive work of art. There's no question. But we didn't believe that it merited some sort of trigger warning outside the gallery. If people come in and they don't like it, there are a lot of things they can do about that. They could turn around and leave. They could write a letter to me. They could publish or post something on the web. There are lots of things you can do to express your concern. Our obligation is to justify why it's on the wall. The Met has a lot of wall space, but it has more things in storage than it does on the wall. That means decisions are being made that this merits being here and this doesn't. Why is that merit being here? The challenge of getting the label right is helping the audience understand why this work of art is worthy of their time and their scrutiny. So I think navigating this political moment is very, very difficult because we have moved, especially in recent weeks, from issues that were relatively just political to issues that are absolutely around human rights and protecting freedom of expression, but at the same time recognizing that these are very, very challenging times in which to have debate and discourse. I don't envy people who have to make those decisions, but that's the job.
So, I mean, after reading your book, which again really focuses on the political issues of museums today, like what is the museum discourse? We really wanted to hear your thoughts on repatriation in museums like the Met, who have very large collections that, you know, at one time they were considered encyclopedic. Maybe now, as you discuss in your book, we're shifting those terms a little bit. But you know, all of these objects from all over the world, and you speak about this extensively in your book. But we're wondering how the Met and other museums have expanded their initiatives to repatriate cultural items, and to what extent a director of the museum, sort of at the top of that hierarchy, has a role in that sort of process.
Right. This is one of the issues that I think has become increasingly at the forefront of what most museums and organizations that have collections have to deal with. And it is not going to go away, and it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. So at the Met, and let me say also an obvious point, because institutions live in the world they live in, collecting practices, international laws, those things change. So I think the Met thought of itself as an ethical institution in its way, in the same way most museums do, when they were collecting things in ways that would not have absolutely withstood the scrutiny that we provide today. They would not have merited that, and the laws have changed. So how does one deal with this issue? At the Met, in most places, we would distinguish between two categories of issues around repatriation. One is fairly easy and one is harder. The easier issue is legal issues. If somebody comes forward with a claim around a work of art, for whether it's a Holocaust claim or anything, and there's legal evidence that the object does not actually belong to the Met, or whoever the claim is being made against, then there's a legal process for that. You litigate that, or you discuss it in ways to look at the evidence and make a decision. I never struggled with those. No matter what the work of art was, we were perfectly comfortable just letting that process play out in the way that it should, and then giving back the work of art when it was indicated. And very often it was indicated. Evidence emerges that might not have been available, even if you followed exactly the right collecting practices at the time, done everything exactly right. New evidence can emerge and laws can change. So let's set those issues aside. Those are easy. The more difficult ones are ethical issues where title might be one issue, but the right thing to do might be another. One of the issues that comes up in that context is there's the Elgin marbles, for sure. The Benin bronzes is another example. Let's talk about Benin first, very briefly. The Benin bronzes were taken from Benin City in a raid by the British Army in 1897 as part of a retribution for a series of actions that it was a revenge-oriented kind of military expedition. And in 1897, all of that god-awful stuff that they did was not explicitly illegal in international law. So the objects that were taken from Benin City, these great works of art, are now in 150 museums around the world. And they're all legally in those museums because the law didn't change until 1899, just right after that happened, because of that. So the legal issue is fairly clear. There's no litigating the question, but the ethical issue is very profound. Who has a right to these objects, and how do we find justice over the course of a century and a half, given the fact that most of these objects that are now in the world, they may have changed hands many, many times to get into all these museums and these places they are. I think, and what I began doing at the Met when I was there, and I think the right way forward, is for museums to think of themselves as global enterprises with all kinds of interconnections with other institutions. Actually, who holds title to the object is less important and less interesting than how the object is being studied and presented and how these relationships can be fostered. If everyone who had a Benin bronze, all these museums and collections, were to bring them back to Benin City in Nigeria today and nowhere else, that wouldn't be great for anybody, because these great cultural objects are actually the Nigerian people, the Oba, the people who created them and their descendants, they're proud of these objects as well. But they have a right to make a judgment about how those objects should be studied, who should own them. So there are all kinds of ways. We entered into an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with the Nigerian government, and in order to work with them on these questions, to share expertise, to share works of art, and I think that's the direction we're going in around issues of these ethical categories, where the British government has every right, the Greek people have every right to ask for and insist that these objects that are in the British Museum should in some way be in Athens. They're the most important works of art tied to the foundational civilization of democracy in the Western Hemisphere. They're on Great Russell Street in London. So I think there are ways to work that out if the parties are willing. And when I talk about the idea of the ethical museum, I think increasingly that mindset will allow for new ways of thinking about that. And imagine works of art being shared, or every 5 or 10 years they move from one place to another. Expertise is shared. And the Met doesn't only need to do that with Benin material. It could also be lending other objects to the museums in Nigeria that are not about anything related to Benin, but they're related to the partnership and the cultures that they're interested in. So I think there's a very expansive idea here that we're beginning to see come to fruition, and in the next generation, I think that will become more standard.
Thank you so much for that. And we were also interested in hearing your opinions on other recent happenings at the Met. We've seen in recent news that the Met has taken sort of a more aggressive approach to branding and licensing in recent years. And we were interested in sort of the Met fostering partnerships with brands ranging from clothing brands to electronic manufacturers. And we know that these deals can be an important source of revenue to either lower ticket costs or fund certain projects. But we were wondering how you think the museum should balance the benefits of licensing with the potential danger of appearing too commercialized to the public.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll give you a shorter answer than I think. I think on the one hand, institutions like the Met have to fund themselves. That the goal, and they are perpetual institutions, we have an obligation to balance our budget and to pass the institution off to our successors better than we found it. And if you can do those two things, forever, then the museum just gets better forever, right? Because you're doing that. And in order to do that, you have to find the revenue where you can find it. And so I think many of those commercial activities that the Met and others are doing is really intended to not only bring in additional revenue, but it also can connect audiences to what you're doing that aren't always obvious. The Met has a thing called the Costume Institute, which most of you probably never heard of. And that was a joke. The Costume Institute brings more visitors to the museum than any other department does. And each year, this gala that the Met does as a fundraiser, it generates very significant revenue. And there are many ways in which it can be over the top. But it brings people in from all over the world who aren't coming to that museum for any other reason. So some of those commercial engagements allow for, yes, to raise money, but also to just give people some sense of the Met. And then maybe if they're think branding, that's the whole point of branding. It connects people with an idea. And if you can connect people with an idea and then expand on that idea, then they may think of coming to the Met the next time they're there. But it has to be done within balance. And again, we started this conversation by talking about the mission statement. And the Met is not primarily a brand. It's a cultural institution, an educational institution, and a community-owned enterprise that is in service of the public good. If it can sell things that are sort of cool, fine, within the context of that larger objective.
Thank you. And we want to leave some time for questions. And so we just wanted to wrap up. You know, it's been really great talking to someone who has helped shape the museums of today as people who are all interested in careers in museums in the future. And with that in mind, we just wanted to ask you, when you look 10, 15 years down the road, what most excites you in terms of kind of potentials and innovations in the field?
I think the museum profession is going through, even though our society is going through paroxysms of stress of all kinds, I think the museum profession is actually thriving. There has never been greater interest in what museums do. And as we have lost faith and confidence in institutions of all kinds in our society, I don't think that's quite the same in museums. People, they love them in ways that is important. And so I think the future for museums is actually increasingly important because they play an ever larger role in our society, not just as repositories of art and as places for conservation and study, but beyond that. So I think the next generation will be particularly interesting, particularly if some of the themes we've discussed this afternoon actually continue to develop, like this idea of greater global interaction and interdependence. Then the profession that you'll be entering is more lively, more dynamic, more multidimensional than you would if you had entered it 20 years ago. And I think we need institutions like this more than ever, because what actually brings us together as a society? How many kinds of institutions are there that allow people from all over the world to come together in shared purpose without hitting each other over the head? How many are there? If you take museums out of our society, not just the Met, but everywhere, we would be lost. So that aspect of our mission is increasingly important.
Thank you.
Well, I'm excited now for
Yeah.
the museums of the future. So we have about 10 minutes or so left for Q&A. If anybody from the audience has any burning questions, or even some less burning questions, there is a microphone that's going to be circulating. So just feel free to raise your hand and go crazy. Oh.
That was fascinating. Thank you very much. My question is this: where fashions change, academic interests change, and the centrality of particular elements of your collection become uncentral, how do you think museums should react? To what extent is it a matter of being fleet of foot, and to what extent is it a matter of keeping the faith?
Well, at the center of that question is really the collections that you're stewarding and owning. That as museums are repositories of objects of whatever it is they collect. And in the fullness of time, the relative importance of those things might change. So we go through a very thoughtful and careful process to make judgments about what is collected. And there's a very complicated process of accessioning something in. It's like an adoption process. It's very complicated. And once we have it, our job is to take care of it, in theory, forever. And so that commitment is an enduring one. But it is certainly true that collections evolve, societal taste changes, And there are all kinds of reasons why a collection is actually more often than not organic in that it grows and it changes. So there are very thoughtful processes as well for deaccessioning. And I'm a believer that deaccessioning is a good idea. Works of art should live and be in places where they can be respected and studied. And if that isn't going to be in one institution, it's better that it go somewhere else than it go into the basement and never see the light of day again. And most museums of scale have very large storage facilities, including the Met, lots of them. And the goal is for that storage facility only to have in it those things that the Met should hold on to for one reason or another. So I think being nimble, it's a good way of phrasing the question. As the leader of the Met, I always thought about the tension between, on the one hand, being an enduring institution, preserving our legacy and living forever, unlike most organizations. The job of a place like that is to be there forever. And on the other hand, living in the real world right now. And I think the Met and most cultural institutions, and probably Yale University as well, have changed more in the last 5 years than they have in the last 50, at least since the 1960s. And so you need to be ready for that too. I think good leadership, a strong and deep commitment to shared governance, what that really means, where you're hearing voices and representing the general wisdom of the community, and being financially capable of making changes as are necessary are essential to being nimble enough. Too nimble, pivoting too quickly is generally a bad idea for institutions that are supposed to live forever, because they lose their way and they forget why they're here. So that tension lived with me every day in my job.
Thank you for your remarks. I'm eager to hear from you. You're sitting among three of our wonderful students, and I'm sure there are others listening, and I wonder what advice you share with students when they come to you thinking about museum careers and what they need to do to prepare themselves for that future that you've described.
Well, as I said earlier, it's very heartening to see how much interest there is in museums. Among students, I meet with students all the time, and people who want to change careers and are interested in the museum profession. It is a multifaceted profession. There are so many different ways one could be a museum professional. You could be an educator, you could be a curator, a conservator, an accountant, whatever it is I did. There are all these different skills and experiences that are necessary. I think like other professions, it's not that easy to break into. And so what I always ask people is, in the first instance, if you want to go into this sort of work and you really want to be in a museum, tell me why. And it's not enough to say, I've been to the museum 3 times. It seems great. And I'm not sure, my parents want me to work at Goldman Sachs. I'm not sure. That's not an answer that I think is good enough, because it's too hard. And the trade-offs are very substantial. You guys are incredibly talented. There are a lot of things that you can do that are going to be easier than being in the museum profession. But the rewards, they're of another kind. So if someone really wants to do that, then there are lots of jobs they're willing to do. And if they're willing to start wherever they can get that first opportunity and work their way up, the museum profession is full of it is a meritocratic place in the sense that once you're there, in any job, lots of people start in retail sales, for example, and then they work their way elsewhere in the organization. If you're willing to do that and pay attention to what's out there and show what you're committed to and that you're good at it, there's a lot of opportunity. But if your goal is, I think I'd like to be the chief of staff to the CEO, and I'll do that for 3 years, and I've had people talk to me about that. That's not the way you can enter this profession. It really requires a ground-up commitment, a passion to what it's about and what its mission represents. And then there's lots of opportunity, actually.
Thank you. Is there any circumstance where politically you would refuse an acquisition that's offered to you at the museum? It has nothing to do with aesthetics, has nothing to do with cost.
Yes.
It's in perfect shape, but political issues, historical legacies of an individual, of a country, etc.
Every institution actually has a line. And I talk about this in the book. How do we think about where we would draw the line, whether it's a gift of a work of art or a gift of money? The mission, we know what the mission is. So if someone comes to us and says, I'd like to give you money to advance your mission, and the only little glitch is, I want my name to be up there, and I'll get out of prison in 10 years for multiple murders, then we would say the odds are low we're going to do that because we are not in the business of laundering reputations. On the other hand, our job is to advance the mission. We are not a club. We're looking for people who fit into some idea that we have of who the ideal donor is or who would be supportive of us. So I advocate that that line should be drawn very rarely and only in cases where it's very clear that it diminishes the admission of the institution to have an association with that person's money or art. To make that a little more controversial, so let's talk about what that actually means. We can all think of somebody that we wouldn't take their money from. And I could throw out names to be inflammatory, but you could do that yourself. We know they exist. So we know the answer is no to some people. Where it gets complicated is supposing one of those individuals comes to us and says, I want you to have this money or this work of art. I want my name to be completely anonymous. I don't want anyone to ever know that and let's say you could be guaranteed no one will ever know that the Proud Boys paid for that gallery in your museum. No one would ever know that. Would you take their money? Because you're advancing your mission, and in my view, in a case like that, if you're not laundering their reputation and you're not doing anything to elevate or enfranchise them, and all you're doing is advancing your mission, then you have to ask where did the money come from, and you go through that process. But the goal should be to advance your mission, not make judgments about social acceptability, except in the most extreme cases. And most of the time, egregious individuals don't come to us and say, I'd really like to be anonymous. It's not. So it's a little easier than that. But I do think every institution has a line, and every institution with any history has actually done it. Everyone, because you have to.
All right. I think that brings us to the end of our lovely chat here. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thanks for having me.
Maybe we can have a few